"It's just a formality, Mom." He said it so easily. The words floated across the table, light as dust motes in the afternoon sun, slanting through the window. A formality. He was talking about my house. The house my husband, David, and I had built, not with a contractor's crew, but with our own 4 hands, a stack of blueprints, and a stubborn refusal to be sensible. I could still feel the phantom ache in my shoulders from hoisting the drywall, still smell the sawdust that clung to David's hair for a solid year. "For the family's future," Mark added, pushing the deed and the pen a little closer to my side of the table. His hand, so much like his father's in shape but not in texture, rested near mine. His was the hand of a man who worked at a desk. David's hands had been a roadmap of his life. Calluses from the hammer, a faint scar from a slipped saw, the permanent grime under the nails from the good rich earth of the garden. I looked at the document. It was full of dense, black letters, a language I didn't speak but understood perfectly. I saw my name, Eleanor Vance, typed neatly, and a blank space next to it, waiting. I looked back at my son. His smile was still there, patient, expectant. It was the same smile he'd used as a boy when he wanted the last piece of cake, or when he'd borrowed the car and brought it back with the tank on empty. It was a smile that had always worked. A formality. The phrase echoed in the quiet of the room. The only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the steady tick-tock of the grandfather clock in the hall, a clock David had inherited from his own father. Each tick was a beat, a moment, a memory. I thought of all the formalities I had observed over the years. The formal signing of permission slips for school trips I couldn't afford but paid for anyway. The formal RSVPs to weddings of his friends, always with a check tucked inside that was a little too generous. The formal smiles I wore at holiday dinners when his wife, Sarah, would talk about her latest promotion, her new car, her vacation plans that never included a side trip to see me, just a dutiful Christmas morning visit that was timed with a stopwatch. I had been a good mother, a dutiful mother. When David died, I had wrapped myself in the role of the stoic widow, the supportive parent, the grandmother who was always available, always willing. I had become a fixed point in their lives, as reliable and as overlooked as the foundation of this very house. And now, they wanted the foundation for the family's future. My gaze drifted past Mark, to the framed photo on the mantelpiece. It was of David and me, taken the day we'd finished the roof. We were sitting on the peak, grinning like fools, our faces smudged with dirt and sweat, the whole world spread out below us. We weren't just building a house, we were building our future. Future. Not a transferable asset. Not a piece of paper to be signed away as a formality. "Mom?" Mark's voice was gentle, a soft prod. "Is everything okay? You're a million miles away." I brought my eyes back to his. "I was just thinking about your father," I said, my voice even. A flicker of something crossed his face. Impatience. Or perhaps just the conditioned response of a son who had grown weary of his mother's reminiscences. He would have wanted this, Mom, to know that we were all secure, that the house would stay in the family. The house would stay in the family. It sounded so noble, so right. But which family? The family in his mind was him, Sarah, and their 2 children. I, it seemed, was no longer a part of that equation. I was the keeper of the house, the custodian of the memories, but my time was up. I had served my purpose. Now, it was time to sign on the dotted line and fade into the background, perhaps into one of those neat, sterile apartments for seniors I saw advertised on daytime television. The ones with community activities and on-call assistance. The ones that smelled of disinfectant and quiet despair. I picked up the pen. It felt heavy in my hand, heavier than it should have. I looked at the tip, a fine black point that held the power to sign away everything David and I had worked for. Everything I had held on to in the years since he'd been gone. The 4 walls that had absorbed my grief, that had echoed with the phantom sounds of his laughter, that had held me safe in the long, lonely night. "You're right," I said softly. Mark's smile widened. He relaxed in his chair, a subtle shift in his posture that spoke of victory. He thought he had won. He had presented his case, used the right words, family, future, security, and now his sentimental old mother was going to do the sensible thing. I looked down at the deed one last time. I saw the legal description of the property, the parcel number, the official seal of the county clerk. It was all so impersonal, so cold. It had no memory of the summer we spent staining the deck, the argument we had over the color of the kitchen cabinets, the spot on the floor in the living room where our daughter, Chloe, had taken her first steps. This house was not a property. It was a life. A life. Wife. And in that moment, something shifted inside me. It wasn't a loud, shattering crack, but a quiet, seismic realignment. The years of quiet accommodation, of putting my own needs last, of accepting the role they had given me, it all fell away. The woman who had been waiting patiently for her son to see her, to truly see her, was gone. In her place was someone else. Someone who understood that you can't wait for others to value you. You have to value yourself first. I put the cap back on the pen with a soft click. Mark's smile faltered. Mom? What are you doing? I pushed the deed back across the table to him. It's a beautiful house, isn't it? I asked, my voice still quiet, still calm. He looked confused. Yes, of course it is. That's why. I know why, I interrupted gently. You want to secure the family's future, and I think that's a wonderful idea. I stood up and walked over to the sideboard, the one David had built from the wood of an old oak tree that had fallen in a storm. My fingers traced the familiar grain of the wood. I opened the top drawer and took out a long white envelope. I walked back to the table and placed the envelope in front of him, right next to the deed he had so confidently brought with him. His eyes flickered from my face to the envelope and back again. The hopeful, boyish smile was gone completely now, replaced by a look of utter bewilderment. I'm glad we're on the same page, Mom, he said, but his voice was uncertain. What's this? I smiled, a real smile this time. Not the polite, accommodating smile he was used to. This one was all my own. That, I said, is also for the family's future. It's an eviction notice. You and Sarah have 60 days. The silence that followed was a physical thing. It filled the space between us, thick and heavy as wet wool. The tick-tock of the grandfather clock seemed to grow louder, each second a hammer blow against the stillness. Mark just stared at the white envelope as if it were a venomous snake. He didn't touch it. He didn't move. His face, which moments before had been a mask of confident persuasion, was now utterly blank. It was the face of a man whose map of the world had just been set on fire. I waited. I had been waiting my whole life, it seemed. Waiting for David to come home from work. Waiting for the children to get off the school bus. Waiting for the kettle to boil. Waiting for the ache of grief to lessen. Waiting for my son to see me as a person, not a convenience. The waiting was over. Now, I was simply observing. He finally looked up at me, his eyes wide with a confusion so profound it was almost comical. What? What did you say? I said you have 60 days, I repeated, my voice as steady as the hand I now rested on the back of David's empty chair. I think that's a generous amount of time to find a new place to live, don't you? A new place to live? He shook his head, a quick, jerky motion. Mom, this is our home. No, Mark, I said, and the gentleness was gone from my voice now, replaced by a clarity that was as sharp and clean as a shard of glass. This is my home. You and Sarah and the children have been living here, in my home, for the past 5 years. Rent-free, I might add. I believe the term for that is tenants at will. And I, the landlord, am now choosing to terminate that tenancy. The legalistic words sounded strange in my own mouth, but they were also empowering. They created a distance, a boundary, where before there had been none. For years, our relationship had been a messy, undefined blur of love, obligation, and unspoken resentments. Now, it was becoming clear. This is insane, he whispered, finally reaching for the envelope. His fingers trembled slightly as he tore it open. He pulled out the single sheet of paper, and his eyes scanned the words, his lips moving silently. This is a real eviction notice. You went to a lawyer? I didn't need to, I said. You can buy the forms at any office supply store. They have a whole section for landlords. It was very straightforward. The idea that I had done this myself, that I had driven to a store, selected a form, and filled it out with the same calm deliberation I used for my grocery list, seemed to stun him more than anything else. He was looking at me as if he'd never seen me before. And in a way, he hadn't. He had only ever seen his mother. A soft, pliable, predictable figure who existed to meet his needs. The woman who made his favorite pot roast, who always had a cookie in the jar, who would drop everything to babysit at a moment's notice. He had never met Eleanor Vance, the woman who had built a house, buried a husband, and raised 2 children. The woman who had just realized that her resilience was not a limitless resource for others to draw upon. Why? He finally asked, his voice cracking on the single word. After everything, why would you do this to us? To your own family? I sank back into my chair, the strength that had held me upright moments before ebbing away, leaving a hollow ache in its place. I was tired. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion that had been accumulating for years. You asked me to sign the deed over to you, I said simply. You came in here, into the home your father and I built, and you asked me to give it to you, like it was nothing, a formality. You talked about the family's future, but you didn't include me in it. You saw me as an obstacle, a problem to be managed. You weren't asking me to secure our family's future. You were asking me to erase my past. I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table. For 5 years I have watched you and Sarah live in this house. You've repainted the walls, you've replaced the furniture, you've moved my things into the attic to make room for yours. You've treated this place like a stepping stone, a convenience until you could afford something better. And all the while I've lived in the guest room, a visitor in my own home. I've listened to you talk about your plans, your dreams, your future, and not once. I've listened to you talk about your plans, your dreams or future. The memories were flooding in now, sharp and painful. The way Sarah would sigh with exasperation when I told a story about David. The way Mark would cut me off mid-sentence to answer his phone. The grandchildren, who I loved dearly, being taught to call me Nana, a generic storybook name because Grandma Eleanor was too much of a mouthful. I was being slowly, methodically, lovingly erased. I'm not a formality, Mark, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. I am not a ghost who haunts the hallways of your life. I am a woman. And this is my house. And I have decided that I want to live in it. Alone. The malady of that word hung in the air. Alone. It was not a threat or a punishment. It was a statement of intent. A declaration of independence. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He just sat there, the eviction notice clutched in his hand, his face pale. The boyish charm was gone, stripped away to reveal the man underneath. A man I barely knew. A man who had looked at his mother and seen only a means to an end. After a long, heavy silence, he pushed his chair back and stood up. He didn't look at me. He just walked out of the dining room, through the hall, and out the front door. I heard it click shut behind him. I sat at the table for a long time after he left. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the room filled with long purple shadows. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat in the growing darkness, the silence of the house wrapping around me like a blanket. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence full of possibility. The turning point of a life is not always a dramatic, earth-shattering event. Sometimes it is a quiet decision, a word spoken, a line drawn. For me, it was the soft click of a pen cap, the rustle of an envelope, the realization that I had a future of my own, and it was time to start living it. I finally stood up and walked into the kitchen. I filled the kettle with water and set it on the stove. As I waited for it to boil, I looked out the window at the garden. The roses David had planted were in full bloom, their crimson petals a vibrant splash of color in the twilight. I had neglected the garden in recent years, too busy with the demands of being a live-in grandmother. Tomorrow, I thought to myself, tomorrow I will start with the roses. I will prune the dead branches and feed the soil. I will bring them back to life. just like me. The kettle began to whistle, a shrill, cheerful sound that cut through the quiet of the house. It was the sound of a new day dawning. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt ready for it. I was no longer waiting. I was beginning. The sound of the front door clicking shut had been a period at the end of a very long sentence. In the quiet that followed, I did not feel triumph. I did not feel anger. I felt a profound and unsettling emptiness. The house, which had moments before been a battleground, was now just a house, a collection of rooms filled with furniture and memories, and a silence that was heavier than any sound. I walked through the downstairs, my hand trailing along the walls, the cool plaster, a familiar comfort under my fingertips. I was a ghost in my own home. Or rather, the house was the ghost, haunted by the life I had allowed to overshadow my own. That first night, I did not sleep in the guest room. I walked up the stairs, each step a conscious decision. I passed the closed door of the small room I had occupied for 5 years, with its single bed and view of the neighbor's fence. I walked to the end of the hall, to the master bedroom. My bedroom. I pushed the door open. The air inside was still and smelled faintly of Sarah's expensive perfume and Mark's aftershave. Their king-sized bed, a monstrosity of dark wood and a padded headboard, dominated the space. Their clothes were still draped over a chair. A stack of magazines lay on the nightstand. It was a room I had cleaned and tidied for years, but it was not my own. I didn't turn on the overhead light. In the dim glow from the hallway, I stripped the bed. The heavy duvet, the high thread count sheets that had been a Christmas gift from Sarah's parents. I bundled them all in my arms, their foreign softness a strange weight against my chest, and carried them to the laundry room. I did not put them in the washer. I put them in a trash bag. Then I went to the linen closet at the top of the stairs. It was a deep, cedar-lined space where I kept the things that mattered. And there, on the top shelf, wrapped in protective plastic, was my own quilt. The one I had finished the winter after David died. It was a simple log cabin pattern, made from the scraps of his old flannel shirts. I could still name each one. The blue plaid from our anniversary trip to Vermont. The faded red he always wore to work in the garden. The soft, worn gray that had been his favorite. I carried it back to the bare mattress. It smelled of cedar and memory. I unfurled it. The quilt settled over the bed, a patchwork of my past, a blanket of my own making. I found one of David's old pillows in the closet, flat and lumpy in all the right places, and I put a clean, simple cotton case on it. That night, I slept in my own bed for the first time in 5 years. I didn't cry. I just lay there, under the weight of 1,000 memories stitched together, and for the first time since David was gone, I did not feel entirely alone. The house seemed to settle around me, a quiet sigh of relief. We were both coming home. The next day began with the sun. My sun. The sun that came through the large east-facing window of the master bedroom, the window David had designed specifically so we could watch the sunrise without having to lift our heads from our pillows. I had forgotten the particular way the light painted stripes across the wooden floor. I had forgotten the pleasure of it. I made coffee, just for me. I used the old percolator, the one that made the house smell rich and warm. A smell Sarah had complained gave her a headache. I sat at the kitchen table and drank it, black and strong, from my favorite mug, the one with a hairline crack that I refused to throw away. The silence was different this morning. It wasn't an absence of sound. It was a presence. It was peace. The task ahead of me was enormous. The house was full of a life that was not mine. I started methodically. I went to the hardware store, the real one, the old one, downtown with the wooden floors that creaked, not the giant, soulless box store on the highway. I bought boxes, rolls of packing tape, dotting, thick black markers. I started in the living room. The sleek, uncomfortable gray sofa they had bought to replace our comfortable, worn-in leather one. The glass and chrome coffee table that was always covered in fingerprints. I did not pack their things. I moved them. I pushed and dragged and consolidated everything that was theirs into the formal dining room, which we had never used anyway. The house began to breathe again as I uncovered the original furniture, my furniture, that had been relegated to the basement. I wrestled the old leather sofa back into its rightful place. It groaned in protest, but it settled back where it belonged. It felt like an old friend. After a week, the house was divided. The main living areas were mine again, filled with the familiar shapes and shadows of my life with David. The dining room was a fortress of boxes and furniture, a monument to a life that had been lived within my walls, but had never truly been a part of them. I tackled their bedroom next. It was the hardest part. Not emotionally, but physically. The sheer volume of their possessions was staggering. Clothes, shoes, gadgets, books I'd never read, decorative objects that had no meaning. I worked with a strange, detached efficiency. I was an archaeologist excavating a forgotten civilization. I folded sweaters, I wrapped trinkets in newspaper, I taped boxes shut and labeled them in clear block letters. Mark and Sarah. Clothing. Mark and Sarah. Bathroom. Mark and Sarah. Miscellaneous. I found things that should have hurt. A photograph of them on a beach in Mexico, smiling, tanned, and happy. A child's drawing taped to the inside of a wardrobe door. I love Nana's house. The words were a small, sharp sting. I took the drawing down, held it for a moment, and then I slipped it into a box, labeled a bit more gently. Grandchildren, keepsakes. I was not a monster. I was just a woman drawing a line. At the end of that week, I stood in the doorway of the now empty master bedroom. The mattress was still on the floor, covered by my quilt. The room was bare, echoing, and full of light. It was a blank canvas. It was mine. I moved on to the garden. It was overgrown, choked with weeds. The roses were leggy, the hydrangeas were drooping, the vegetable patch was a riot of neglect. I bought new gloves, a sturdy trowel, and a pair of sharp shears. The work was hard. My back ached. My hands were sore. But with every weed I pulled, with every dead branch I snipped, I felt a sense of purpose. I was not just cleaning up a garden. I was cultivating my own life. I was tending to my roots. My fingers, stiff at first, rediscovered the familiar crumble of the dark, rich soil, the metallic scent of the trowel, the satisfying isnipoi of the shears cutting through a dead branch. This was real. After a month, a routine had settled in. Mornings were for the garden. Afternoons were for the house. Evenings were for me. I rediscovered the public library. The quiet rustle of pages, the smell of old paper and binding glue. I checked out books I wanted to read, not books that were on a bestseller list. I started cooking again. Not the large, family-pleasing meals I had been making for years. The pot roasts, the casseroles, the baked chickens. I cooked for myself. One perfect pan-seared pork chop with apples and onions. A small flaky pot pie filled with vegetables from my slowly reviving garden. A simple bowl of pasta with garlic olive oil and a sprinkle of red pepper flakes, eaten while sitting on the back porch, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance. I had not heard from Mark. Not a call. Not a text. Not an email. Part of me had expected a fight, a plea, an angry outburst. But there was only silence. It was a silence that confirmed everything I had already concluded. Their life here had been one of convenience. Now that it was no longer convenient, they were gone. The 60-day notice period expired on a Tuesday. I noted the date on the calendar, but I did nothing. I did not watch the clock. I did not sit by the phone. I spent the day in the garden, planting new lavender bushes along the walkway. Their clean herbal scent filled the air. At 4 o'clock, the phone rang. I wiped my hands on my jeans and answered it in the kitchen. Mom. It was Mark. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Hello, Mark, I said. There was a pause. We're ready to get our things. We've rented a truck. Would this weekend be okay? The weekend is fine, I said. I've packed everything. It's all in the dining room. The door will be unlocked. You won't be there? There was a note of surprise in his voice. No, I said. I have plans. I did not, in fact, have plans. But I was not going to be there. I was not going to supervise. I was not going to watch them dismantle the life they had tried to build on top of mine. "Okay," he said, after another long pause. "Okay, Mom. We'll be quick. I know you will," I said, and then I hung up. That weekend, I checked into a small, inexpensive motel by the coast, a place I hadn't been to in 30 years. I walked on the beach. I ate fried clams from a cardboard box. I read a book from cover to cover. When I came home on Sunday evening, the dining room was empty. They had left a key on the table. They had not even gone through the rest of the house to see the changes I had made. They had taken what was theirs and left. It was as if they had never been there at all. Autumn arrived, and the house was truly mine. The garden was a tapestry of gold and red. The lavender I had planted was thriving. The house settled into a comfortable rhythm of my own making. One Saturday, I decided it was time to put my bed on a proper frame. I also decided I deserved new sheets. I went back to the old hardware store for the bed frame, a simple, sturdy metal one. As I was trying to figure out which screws to use, a man about my age, with kind eyes and hands dusted with sawdust, approached me. "That one's a bit tricky," he said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble. "The instructions are terrible. You need the 1/4-inch bolts, not the 1/2-inch ones they tell you to use." "Thank you," I said, surprised. "I was just about to make a mistake. Happens to the best of us," he smiled. "Building something?" "Putting my life back together, one piece at a time," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. He didn't laugh or look away. He just nodded, a look of quiet understanding in his eyes. "I know that feeling," he said. "My name's Arthur. I work here part-time, mostly. I just try to keep people from using the wrong bolts." "Eleanor," I said, and for the first time I shook a stranger's hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Arthur." It wasn't a spark. It wasn't a romance. It was something quieter, and perhaps more valuable. It was a connection. A moment of being seen, not as a mother, not as a grandmother, but as a person. A fellow builder. That afternoon, I put the bed frame together using the correct bolts. It was solid and secure. Then I went to a proper department store. I walked past the sensible, budget-friendly percale sheets. I went right to the top-shelf linens. I chose a set of heavy, creamy, Egyptian cotton sheets. They were outrageously expensive, more than I had spent on myself in a decade. I paid for them in cash. The young woman at the counter folded them carefully and wrapped them in tissue paper, as if they were a precious gift. And they were. They were a gift from me, to me. That night, as I slipped into my own bed, in my own room, between my own cool, smooth sheets, I finally understood the profound luxury of having a space that was entirely, unequivocally, my own. It was a small victory, but it was the one that mattered most. The war was over. The peace was just beginning. The first winter I spent alone in the house was a quiet revelation. I had always dreaded winter. It had meant slushy boots in the hallway, wet coats dripping on the floor, the constant battle with the thermostat as Mark and I waged a silent war between his preference for a cool house and my old bones' need for warmth. It had meant a house full of noise and obligation. But this winter was different. The house was mine, and I kept it warm. I let the thermostat sit at a comfortable 72 degrees. I built fires in the fireplace not just for heat, but for the companionable crackle and the scent of burning oak that reminded me of David. The snow fell outside, blanketing the world in a thick, sound-dampening layer of white, and inside there was only peace. I would sit for hours in the old leather armchair, the one with the permanent impression of David's shoulders, and read. I read thick histories and slim volumes of poetry. I read until my eyes grew tired, and then I would just watch the fire, my mind quiet, my heart still. It was on one such afternoon, with a pale, low sun casting long blue shadows across the snow, that the past arrived. It came in a small, unassuming rectangle of paper, delivered by the mailman who now knew me by name. I saw the envelope lying on the welcome mat, and I knew before I even picked it up. The handwriting was Mark's. It was the same hurried, slightly backward slanting script from 100 school permission slips and Mother's Day cards. I picked it up. The paper was cold from its journey. I carried it into the kitchen and set it on the counter, next to a bowl of winter oranges. I did not open it right away. I made myself a cup of tea, the slow ritual a comfort in itself. I spooned honey into the steaming liquid and watched it swirl and dissolve. I was not afraid of what was inside the letter. I was not angry. I felt only a distant, clinical curiosity, like a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. Finally, I sat at the kitchen table, the one I had stripped and refinished myself over a sunny week in October, and slid my finger under the flap of the envelope. The letter inside was 2 pages long, written on the kind of generic stationery you can buy in a supermarket. I read it slowly. It was exactly what I had expected, and yet, it was not. It was a masterpiece of subtle manipulation, a carefully constructed tapestry of guilt and nostalgia. He wrote of the holidays, of how strange it had been not to gather at the house. He didn't call it my house. He called it the house, as if it were a public landmark, a place that belonged to everyone and no one. He wrote that the boys, my grandsons, kept asking when they were going to go to Nana's for her cookies. He said Sarah was finding their new apartment cramped and soulless, that she missed the garden. He never once said, I was wrong. He never once said, I'm sorry. Instead, he wrote, I don't know what happened, Mom. I lie awake at night trying to figure out where we went wrong. He wrote, I just want things to go back to the way they were. I read that last line twice. I just want things to go back to the way they were. He was not apologizing for his actions. He was lamenting the consequences. He missed the convenience. He missed the free rent. He missed the built-in babysitter and the cook. He missed the woman who had existed solely for his benefit. He did not miss me, Eleanor. He had never really known me to begin with. I finished my tea. The kitchen was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the snow in shades of pink and lavender. The letter lay on the table, its ink a testament to a life I no longer live. There was a time when those words would have broken me, a time when the mention of my grandson's sorrow would have been a spear in my heart, a summons I could not refuse. But that time was gone. I had spent the last 6 months building a new life, brick by brick, choice by choice. I had learned the profound difference between being alone and being lonely. I had rediscovered the sound of my own thoughts, the shape of my own desires. My peace was a new and precious thing, and I found I was fiercely protective of it. This letter was an attempt to breach the walls I had so carefully built. It was a test. I stood up and took the letter. I walked back into the living room, where the fire was now a bed of glowing embers. I did not throw the letter into the flames. That felt too dramatic, too emotional. It would have given the words a power they did not deserve. Instead, I folded the 2 pages neatly and slipped them back into the envelope. I walked over to the sturdy wooden desk David had built, the one now covered with my library books and seed catalogs for the spring. I opened the bottom drawer, the one filled with old utility bills, appliance manuals, and forgotten tax returns. I placed the letter inside at the very back, behind a warranty for a refrigerator we no longer owned. I closed the drawer. The click was soft, but final. It was not an act of forgiveness. I was not ready for that. It was not an act of anger. I had moved past that. It was an act of severance. A quiet, decisive closing of a door. I would not reply. I would not call. I would not allow his version of the past to dictate my future. My silence would be my answer. The letter was now just a piece of paper in a drawer, an artifact from another life. It had no power here. I went back to my chair, added a log to the fire, and watched as the new flames licked at the old wood, catching hold, growing stronger. I picked up my book and found my place. The story continued. And so would I. The house and I came back to life together with the spring. The first crocuses pushed their way through the last remnants of snow, their purple and yellow heads a brave declaration of survival. The garden, which had slept under its white blanket, began to stir. The lavender I had planted was now established, its silvery green leaves promising a summer of fragrance. The rose bushes, pruned and fed, were covered in the tight, red fists of new buds. My days found their own gentle rhythm. I woke with the sun. I drank my coffee on the back porch, a thick wool sweater wrapped around my shoulders, and watched the world awaken. I'd spend the morning in the garden, my hands in the dirt, feeling the pulse of the earth. Sometimes Arthur, my friend from the hardware store, would stop by on his way to work, a thermos of coffee in his hand, and we'd sit on the porch steps and talk about nothing in particular. The weather, the stubbornness of weeds, the best way to support a tomato plant. Our conversations were easy, unburdened by history or expectation. They were just pleasant, a small, bright spot in the day. My life was not grand. It was not exciting in the way the world seems to value. But it was real. And it was mine. I had discovered a contentment that was deeper and more abiding than any happiness I had known before. It was the contentment of self-possession, the quiet joy of a life lived on one's own terms. This morning, I'm sitting on the back porch. The air is warm, and it carries the scent of freshly cut grass and the sweet perfume of the climbing rose that has finally reached the top of the trellis. My coffee is in my favorite mug, the one with the crack. In my hand is a seed packet. Wildflowers. I plan to scatter them along the back fence line, to create a meadow of color for the bees and the butterflies. I am not planting for anyone else. I am planting for the simple, profound pleasure of seeing something beautiful grow. I take a sip of coffee and look out over my small kingdom, the neat rows of vegetables, the vibrant flower beds, the green expanse of the lawn. The house stands behind me, solid and warm at my back. It is no longer just a house. It is my sanctuary, my partner, my home. So, that's my story. Or at least a part of it that matters most. It's not really a story about deeds and eviction notices. It's not even a story about a mother and a son. It's a story about the quiet, terrifying, and ultimately liberating act of claiming your own space. Maybe you know the feeling. Maybe you felt yourself slowly being erased, made to feel like a guest in your own life. Maybe you've been the reliable one, the convenient one, the one who always says yes, until the sound of your own voice becomes a distant echo. We are taught that it is noble to put others first, to sacrifice for family, to keep the peace. And it can be. But there is a line. A point where sacrifice becomes self-annihilation. A point where keeping the peace means losing yourself. The most important piece of real estate you will ever own is the space you occupy in your own life. It's the only one that can't be bought or sold. It can only be given away. And when you give it away, you lose something far more valuable than property. You lose your center. My journey back to myself didn't start with a dramatic confrontation. It started with a quiet click of a pen cap. It started with the simple, powerful realization that I had had enough. Enough is a holy word. It's the beginning of every revolution, big and small. It's the moment you stop waiting for someone else to value you and decide to value yourself. It's the moment you realize that my own bed, my own time, my own choices, my own life, are two of the most beautiful words in the English language. So, I'll leave you with a question. What is the one small corner of your life that you need to reclaim? It doesn't have to be a house. It can be an hour of your day. It can be a hobby you let go of. It can be a simple, honest, no way. Whatever it is, I hope you find the quiet courage to tend to it. I hope you give yourself permission to plant something new, just for you. If you feel like it, tell me about it in the comments below. I'll be here. I'll be reading. And I'll be cheering you on.